Hi everyone, my name is Angus Wright and I'm a junior research group leader at the Ruhr University Bochum. Today I'm going to be presenting to you the final cosmological results from cosmic shear with the kilodegree survey, so-called KiDS legacy. Today I'm going to be presenting alongside two of my co-authors, Benjamin Stelzner and Robert Reischke. Here you can see an example of gravitational lensing in a very cartoony fashion whereby the light from a background source, shown here as the galaxy, is propagating through the universe in all directions, and it encounters a foreground mass in the form of this galaxy cluster. And light that is endeavoring to travel in straight lines travels through this area of non-flat space-time, and you can see that causes an effective curvature of the trajectories of the light ray. And in this case, the trajectory of the light ray is bent so much that you end up with multiple images of the background galaxy appearing on both sides of the galaxy cluster. This is the regime that we generally refer to as strong gravitational lensing. And you can see what this sort of a thing might look like on the sky in this simulation from Méliès in 1999, where they've simulated a background field of galaxies in negative years. And you can see in this pink blob that I've got down the bottom here that there is a region where there is a foreground mass. Now that foreground mass in this simulation doesn't have any starlight in it, so it is a dark matter mass. And you can see that that mass is causing a distortion of the background light, which you can see quite visually, the arcing and bending of the galaxy images. The regime that we are going to be talking about is the opposite regime to this strong gravitational lensing regime, which is shown in this blue area, and that's the weak gravitational lensing regime. And you can see in this blow up on the right-hand side here of this area in the weak gravitational lensing regime, individual galaxy images don't appear to have any visual distortion attributed to them by the presence of this foreground massive structure. But if you take the measured ellipticities or shapes of all of the galaxies in this image on the right, shown as the little ellipses that are drawn over the top of each galaxy, and you take the average ellipticity of all the sources, what you find is that mean ellipticity, the effectively shown by the red bar here, is a very good tracer of the mean gravitational impact or shear applied to these galaxies by that foreground gravitational potential. It's shown as the yellow tip. Making this a little bit more mathematical, what we can see here is that what we have for every individual source is a combination of the intrinsic source's ellipticity, the fact that galaxy images typically look like ellipses of some shape or orientation or inclination, and then that ellipticity is modified by the presence of a weak gravitational shear, this small g. And that gives us the effective ellipticity of every individual source. And what we do is we take the arithmetic mean of all of the sources' ellipticities on the sky, and we're effectively performing this averaging here. And so we take this averaging of the observed ellipticity properties, and we effectively are taking the average of the intrinsic ellipticity and the average gravitational shear. And what we find is that in the limit where we can make the assumption that the mean ellipticity of sources is equal to 0, that is, galaxies don't preferentially align with one another on the sky, then the mean ellipticity is a proxy for the mean shear. Now, it turns out that that assumption that the mean intrinsic ellipticity is intrinsically 0 for populations of galaxies on sky is a bad one. And it's a bad one for a number of reasons, but mostly due to this thing called galaxy intrinsic alignments, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. We generally get around that through modeling. So that brings us to the main point of what we want to talk about today, which is what is cosmic shear. So we understand that we have weak gravitational lensing, and that weak gravitational lensing is able to imprint a signal upon the measured shapes of galaxies. How do we use that to infer details of cosmic structure and of the cosmological parameters of our universe? So here is the fundamentals of cosmic shear. This is the world's smallest cosmic shear survey. It consists of two galaxies, and you can see those two galaxies here in the background. And the light from those two galaxies propagates through the universe. Now, as the light from these two galaxies propagates through the universe, it passes through gravitational potential. You can see it passes through the same gravitational potential here, different gravitational potential here, and then the same gravitational potential here. And what happens is, as the light from these two galaxies passes through common large-scale structures, it feels a similar gravitational effect on its shear, on its ellipticity. And what that does is it takes initially uncorrelated shapes of galaxies and induces a correlation in the shapes between those two galaxies as observed on sky. And this induced correlation is dependent on the amount of and clustering strength of matter along the line of sight. And you can imagine why this is the case, because that correlation signal is going to be dependent on the separation between the galaxies on sky. If they are closer to one another on sky, then they will have more likely passed through similar large-scale structures. But it then is also dependent on the strength of the proximity between these individual large-scale structures. In, again, mathematical terms, what this means is that we are interested in calculating the coherency of ellipticity measured between pairs of galaxies as a function of their separation from one another on the sky. And we can do that just with galaxy imaging surveys. So we can take the images of galaxies, images of pairs of galaxies, project their shapes along a radial direction between them, and that gives us two measures of ellipticity, measures that are projected in the radial direction, and we call that gamma t, and the component of the ellipticity that is projected in the off diagonal, or rather off 45-degree offset from the radial direction, and that we call gamma cross. Now, these are the same shear components as what I was mentioning previously with a small g. They've changed the gammas here for a reason that isn't super important. But we then do this measurement in bins of angular separation on sky, in our angular separation variable here being theta. And this is something that we can measure directly from galaxy images. We don't need anything else. Just have the images themselves, and we're able to measure this thing called the two-point shear correlation function, psi plus or minus, depending on how we combine the tangential and cross components of our shear. The really unique and nice thing about gravitational lensing cosmic shear is that the signal that we measure on sky is very directly related to the thing that we care about, which is the matter-power spectrum. The matter-power spectrum of all matter being this thing that I'm showing in the gold box here, P delta. It doesn't require us to have any knowledge of galaxy bias. It doesn't require us to have any knowledge of fundamental ways in which galaxies populate dark matter halos, but rather it gives us a direct measure of the intrinsic distribution of all matter in the universe. And we can get from the thing that we want, which is this P delta, to the thing that we measure, psi plus minus, with two fairly mundane mathematical transformations. The first of which is a line of sight integral, this one here, that takes us into pk of L. And then we do a Hankel transform to take us from L into theta, from Fourier space to real space. And with those two fairly straightforward mathematical transformations, we can go from the cosmological properties of the thing that we care about, which is governed by fundamental cosmological parameters, to the observable that we make on sky. And so that means that we can get to where we want to be with a fairly straightforward process. However, that process requires the knowledge of one important wriggly little caveat, and that is the source redshift distribution, the distribution of the line of sight of all of the source galaxies that go into the calculation of our correlation function. And that's an observed quantity. And every single theoretician or modeling person in the audience then brittles because we have an observed quantity embedded in the very heart of the modeling part of our correlation function. And so it's a very, very important point to understand how those redshift distributions are constructed and where they come from. In practice, we do this measurement of psi plus minus or shear correlation functions in bins of approximate line of sight distance, which we call tomographic bins. In this case, which is an analysis done in 2021 by Asghari et al., you can see that we have the shear correlation function measured in 5 tomographic bins, and the observed data shown in blue compared to the best fit model shown in red. And we do these correlations between pairs of galaxies in bins of the same line of sight separation as going out in distance, shown as 1 through 5, and then also in the cross correlation bins between line of sight sources in this line of sight bin and sources in the closest line of sight bin. When we do this measurement, we're able to then estimate the, in particular, clustering strength and amount of matter in the universe. Those two parameters are quantified by what's called sigma 8 here, clustering strength or the amplitude of fluctuations of dark matter, and the capital omega m, the amount of matter in the universe. And you can see that that measurement that we make produces a strong degeneracy between these two parameters. That is, that if we have a small amount of matter in the universe that is densely clustered, or a large amount of matter in the universe that is weakly clustered, we see the same signal from cosmic shear, from psi plus minus, or from any other way of combining the 2-point correlation functions into other measurements, which are shown here by two other statistics called Casades and band powers, which we're going to come back to a little bit later. And so what we generally do is we parameterize out this degeneracy, which is usually referred to as the cosmic shear banana, into a new parameter, which we call S8. And S8, you can see formulated here, is therefore the removal of that degeneracy and gives us the constraints in the optimum degeneracy direction, or in the normal degeneracy direction of cosmic shear. If there is still some component of that degeneracy present, that is to say that this root here over the omega m is not the most fitting degeneracy direction for the banana, then we can make a more general calculation of capital sigma 8, which allows the exponent here to be freely fit. And so we can remove any residual degeneracy that you can see, for example, here in the band power. So that's how we do cosmic shear and how we measure cosmological parameters for cosmic shear. The question then becomes, what do we need in order to get this right? What does one need to do in order to be accurate or robust in your measurement of cosmological parameters from cosmic shear? And there are 4 things, generally speaking, that one needs to do well in order to do robust cosmic shear measurement. The first of which is you have to be able to measure shapes. It's very difficult to measure a shape correlation function if you can't measure shapes well. And so therefore, imaging surveys for cosmic shear usually have a very high fidelity imaging so that they can measure high fidelity shapes of galaxies. You need to estimate the source redshift distribution well. And we're going to ham on this quite a bit. You need to be able to model the source galaxy population, and this is primarily to do with that thing I mentioned earlier called intrinsic alignments. If it turns out galaxies preferentially align with one another on sky because of something like, for example, environment, then it's important to understand those facts and to remove that signal from your estimate of cosmic shear, or to model that signal in your estimate of cosmic shear. And then lastly, it's important to model baryons. And the reason for that is because baryons populate dark matter halos as well, and they have this annoying habit of getting in each other's way. And as a result, they can cause the collapse of dark matter halos to be slowed, and that can cause a change to the clustering distribution of matter. And so we can get an incorrect estimate of the clustering strength of matter if we don't correctly account for the role that baryons play in the puffing up of dark matter halos. And I'm going to now focus on why line of sight localization, that is the estimation of the redshift distributions and the calibration of those redshift distributions, is so fundamental for cosmic shear. And so we go back again to our world's smallest cosmic shear survey, one you can see here on your screen. And I'm now going to use this as a demonstration of why understanding the photometric redshift distribution of your source galaxies is so vital to the measurement of cosmology with cosmic shear. So let's say that our redshift distribution of our source population has a mean redshift that is out here at this mean Z true. But let's say now that we misestimate the actual mean redshift of our sample as being this much, much lower redshift of mean ZF. Now, crucially, when we make that mistake, that doesn't change the measurement that we make on sky. We still observe the same sky because we make this error in our redshift distribution estimation. Because we make this error in our redshift distribution estimation, that doesn't change how we interpret the intrinsic modeling of the source galaxy population. It also doesn't change how we interpret baryon feedback effects as propagating in the universe. And so really, when we do this, when we make this error in redshift distribution estimation, we see the same observed signal on sky, and we model it with the same assumptions as we would if we had not made that error. And that means that we then see the same signal and we attribute it to a much shorter line of sight in the universe, which means that naturally we have to interpret that the universe is more densely clustered and has more matter in it than is actually the case. And this is a direct manifestation of a bias in the cosmological parameter that we care about, S8. And so understanding the source redshift distribution is really, really fundamental. So that brings us to stage 3 analysis of cosmic shear with the kilodegree survey and the analyses that we have done. DR5 is more than just an incremental increase in area going above the 1,000 square degrees of data previously analyzed by the kilodegree survey. In DR5, we present not only an increase in area to 1347 square degrees of data, but a complete re-reduction of the survey to include additional depth in the I band, one of the crucial bands for our photometric redshift estimation, an extension of the survey to higher redshift in the form of a sixth tomographic bin, new and better estimates of the source redshift distribution that I'm going to focus on, and we also update our covariance and intrinsic alignment modeling through better models and new codes that we're going to be talking about as well. And then finally, the analysis of KiDS legacy as is standard in the field was done fully blinded. That is, we performed all of our catalogs to cosmology analyses on 3 data vectors, one of which was the correct one, 2 of which were fictitiously moved by approximately 1 sigma in a direction that we did not know, so possibly up to 2 sigma away, as you can see in the diagram here, where we have 3 blinds, blind A being quite consistent with the previous results from KiDS 1000, blind C being in between Planck and the analysis of KiDS 1000, and blind B being quite consistent with Planck. And we then, only once we were happy with our pipelines and felt that our analysis was static, decided to unblind. And when we unblind, we find that the KiDS legacy analyses are fully consistent with the results of the Planck CMB. That is, we have a consistency with the Planck survey that is at 0.7 sigma. Now, as you can see on the plot on the right, there is still a considerable degeneracy between S8 and omega M, which is indicative that the formulation of S8 is not the optimal degeneracy direction for the constraints that we have in KiDS legacy. And as such, the results that we present in KiDS legacy are presented both in S8 as per normal in the literature and in terms of capital sigma 8, where we've optimized the alpha term to be best fit for each of our 2-point data vectors. And here you can see the capital sigma 8 constraints for Casabi's, and you can see those are consistent with Planck at the level of 0.73 sigma, and for our band powers, which you can see are consistent with Planck at the level of 1 sigma, both of which being well below the level required for a measurement of inconsistency, which is at 2.3 sigma. We've also compared our results with KiDS legacy to the other stage 3 surveys that are published already. And as you can see, that's the dark energy year 3 hybrid analysis from the KiDS plus DES analyses and the HSC Y3 analysis of cosmic shear correlation functions. And both of those results are consistent with the results from KiDS legacy. This is a measurement of cosmic shear and the consistency between the measurements of cosmic shear in the stage 3 surveys. And in KiDS legacy, we've also done a joint analysis, in particular with the dark energy survey. And I'll pass this over to Benjamin.
In addition to our fiducial cosmic shear analysis, we have also combined KiDS legacy with various external datasets. And this includes cosmic shear from DES year 3, BAO measurements from DESI, and supernovae from Pantheon Plus. And we've also looked at BAO from eBOS instead. It's not shown in this plot here, but you can also find it in the paper. And individually, all these external datasets are found to be very consistent with KiDS legacy, and this then enables a combined analysis. It's important to note here that KiDS and DES have some overlap on Sky, and this is why we don't use the fiducial DES data vector. Instead, we use a version that excludes the overlapping region of the 2 surveys. And in the plot on the right here, you can see the result of our combined analysis of KiDS, DES, DESI, and Pantheon Plus. And this results in our most precise measurement of S8 to date.
So that begs an interesting question. We have got an analysis of KiDS legacy that is fully consistent with the CMB measurements from Planck. And in 2021, in KiDS 1000, we had a very different story. We had a story of a roughly 3 sigma tension with Planck. And so the question then becomes, what happened? What changed between KiDS 1000 or earlier KiDS analyses and KiDS legacy to lead us to the point where we now no longer show any significant tension in S8, no significant discrepancy between low redshift and high redshift probes of structure as measured by cosmic shear? The path to KiDS legacy has been a fairly long one, and the first analyses of KiDS was KiDS 450, performed by Hildebrandt et al. In 2017. And as we progressed from Hildebrandt et al. In 2017 to this work in KiDS Legacy that we are presenting today, we have changed many, many things in the analysis, both in terms of the final analysis choices that went into KiDS Legacy, shown in green, or intermediate changes that we made along the way and then changed again for KiDS Legacy, shown in pink. But the point here is to say that KiDS Legacy, if you bring your eye down the final column, is really a changing of many, many, many parts of the analysis pipeline, both in terms of area, in terms of signal to noise, and in terms of analysis choices and methodology. And so KiDS Legacy really did change quite a lot of things. And then when we unblinded and found that we were consistent with Planck, we needed to ask ourselves, okay, what is the choice or the combination of choices that has produced the majority of the change that we saw since 2021? And so with that in mind, we did a forensic analysis of what is required or what happened when we analyzed KiDS 1000 or KiDS Legacy using the analysis choices of the other side of the coin, of KiDS 1000 or Legacy, or of Legacy with KiDS 1000. So here you can see the results published by Asghari et al. In 2021, and you can see that the consistency, or rather tension, with Planck is given at 3.75 sigma. Lee et al. In 2023 presented a new estimate of cosmic shear using KiDS 1000, where they, in addition to other things, updated the scale cut used for the analysis. And that reduces the tension with Planck to 2.93 sigma. Our new NFZ calibration methods that we implemented for Legacy, applied then to KiDS 1000, produces another shift of about 0.8 sigma, which brings the tension lower again. And then when we use the updated redshift calibration sample that we have access to in KiDS Legacy, that also reduces the tension by another 0.4-ish sigma. If we add in the shapes that we used in KiDS Legacy rather than the shapes measured in KiDS 1000, that reduces the tension again by about 0.4 or 0.5 sigma. And if we then go to the new methods of modeling intrinsic alignments and the new IS tomographic bin, then we see that that doesn't change the central value of our S8 parameter, but rather decreases the error bar caused by the addition of higher redshift information with high signal to noise. And that creates an artificial increase in the tension to about 1.4 sigma. And then when we add in our additional area, we see a final shift in capital sigma rate of about 0.7 sigma. Brings us to our final value of consistency with Planck at 0.73 sigma. Now, the crucial point that I want to hammer home with this diagram here is that the values beyond this data point here, and including this data point here, are all formally consistent with the results from Planck. So our, again, tension metric at 2.3 sigma requires that these data points all be considered consistent with the CMB. And that means that redshift calibration and the sample that are used for redshift calibration really are the driving difference between the analyses of KiDS 1000 and KiDS Legacy. That is, we can go from approximately 3 sigma here to approximately 1.6 sigma just by changing the calibration and estimation methods of redshift distribution in KiDS 1000 before we even ask the question of what happens when I move to the KiDS Legacy area or the KiDS Legacy imaging. Now, of course, given the time constraints of a talk like this, we naturally can't go through all of the changes that we've made to the KiDS Legacy analysis. And so what we've decided to do is to highlight one facet of each of the major components of the KiDS Legacy analysis that have changed in an effort to give an indication of sort of the holistic picture of the scale of things that have changed in the analysis as a whole. So you can see we're going to highlight here on the data side the change to the N of Z estimation and bias estimation. On the modeling side, updates to the covariance, and on the validation side, updates to the internal consistency metrics. So on the redshift distribution estimation and calibration side, there have been 3 primary changes that we've made to the analysis of KiDS Legacy that are of importance. The first of which is the shift in the way in which we estimate which wide field sources are calibratable, given the sample of calibration objects that we have. The second is the distribution of calibration objects itself. And thirdly is the way in which we estimate bias using the simulations and our redundant estimate methods of energy using what's called cross-correlation. In KiDS Legacy, we perform a machine learning redshift distribution calibration that's become somewhat standard in the literature, which is based around the use of a self-organizing map, a machine learning unsupervised classification algorithm that allows interpretation of high-dimensional parameter spaces in 2D. So what we have is a self-organizing map here, for example, on the left, which is trained on galaxy colors and then populated with calibrating spectra. Or the measurement of our redshift distribution proceeds by taking the associations in this color space and reweighting the spectroscopic information so that the relative population of the spectroscopic SOM is the same as the relative population of the SOM by wide field shear sources, which is what's shown on the right. The way in which we estimate and calibrate these redshift distributions has changed in Legacy. And that's the first two data points that I showed on my diagram of what has changed since 2021. And so what did we change and how did we change it and why did we change it? One of the things that we improved in KiDS Legacy was to move beyond what we called gold class in KiDS 1000 to what we call gold weight in KiDS Legacy. When we populate the self-organizing map with our calibrating spectra, a la the last slide, we find that there are cells that don't contain any calibrating sources. They contain wide field shear sources, but no spectroscopic calibrators. Such an example you can see here from simulations, where on the left-hand side, I have a self-organizing map colored by the true redshift of the wide field shear sample. And on the right-hand side, I have the occupation of the cell in terms of this gold class, whether or not we have a cell that contains calibrating spectra, one or more, shown in green, or no calibrating spectra, shown in orange. And that means that the cells that are orange cannot be calibrated, and so the wide field shear sources that occupy those cells cannot be used for cosmology. And so what we did in KiDS 1000 was to identify those cells and remove them. However, one of the things we noticed in KiDS Legacy is that the association of these spectroscopic sources to their wide field counterparts, i.e. the calculation of this gold class, because it is based on a noisy machine learning association with the self-organizing map, is itself a noisy process. And if you repeat this process multiple times, then what you find is that the gold class assignment isn't always the same for each source. And so if you calculate the gold class assignment multiple times, and then you populate the SOM here with the mean gold class or the mean number of times that a source was assigned gold 1 compared to the SOM cell that it resides in, then what you find is that this now continuous variable, which we've called gold weight, is not necessarily closely correlated or perfectly correlated with the individual assignments of gold class in one realization. And you can see that here by the fact that our orange outlined cells don't always contain red SOM cells inside them. That is to say that the gold weight of these sources in orange, enveloped by orange lines, aren't always poorly sampled by spectra. Indeed, there are some regions of the self-organizing map where the initial gold class equals 0 cells actually have a gold weight of quite high, near 1, where under multiple retrainings, these cells are actually quite well represented. And similarly, there are cells that were previously classed as gold, where we have relatively few spectra calibrating them after multiple realization. One of the additional improvements that we've made in KiDS Legacy is the introduction of the KiDS Z sample. These are KiDS and Viking-like observations made over legacy calibration fields of spectra so that we can then include these calibrating spectra in our estimation of redshift distribution. Here you can see the location of these fields on sky, but probably a more useful diagram is the distribution of these fields in terms of the redshifts that they contain, shown here as little wedge plots with RA on the end of the wedge and redshift on the long side of the wedge. And here you can see the distribution of all calibrating spectra that we had access to for data release 4 for KiDS 1000. If I now paint in all of the calibrating spectra that we have available to us for Legacy, you can see that there is a considerable increase in the number of calibrating spectra that we have access to for KiDS Legacy. Indeed, there is nearly a factor of 5 more calibrating spectra in KiDS Legacy than we had access to in KiDS 1000. One of the things that this greatly improved or increased spectroscopic compilation brings with it, though, is greater complexity in the generation of our simulations in order to estimate the bias in our redshift distribution. In KiDS, we've for a long time used very realistic, complex image simulations in order to estimate the shape calibration biases of our survey. We've also used complex simulations to estimate the redshift distribution biases in the form of light cone simulations with realistic photometric noise applied to them using, for example, the MICE2 suite of simulations. In KiDS Legacy, we've also improved the way in which we estimate and generate our simulations, both to do a joint image simulation for redshift distribution estimation and M calibration, the shape measurement biases. But furthermore, we've also improved the way in which we generate the redshift distribution calibration samples within the simulations themselves. These two features of our simulations now mean that we're able to generate more realistic simulations of our samples and get more realistic estimates of the biases of our redshift distributions that we estimate both with the self-organizing map and with cross correlations. And here you can see an example that shows that for the first time in KiDS Legacy, we're able to model the bias in the SOM using simulations and recover the exact same bias or an equivalent bias in the CC method applied to the simulations as if they were data. This indicates that we now not only have robust measurements of bias, but a redundant form of estimating the bias using the cross correlations that return the same estimated bias as we get from our simulations. When we apply this to the data, we see very similar performance insofar as the bias that we estimate with our now multi-band image simulations that model M calibration and DZ calibration return biases that are very, very similar to those that are returned by the cross-correlation method, shown as the difference between the blue dashes and the red points here. And crucially, if we use the difference in bias that we see here to model our cosmic shear signal, we find that the difference between using the fiducial bias estimated on the simulations for our SOM method and using the estimated biases as returned by our independent method using cross-correlations return exactly the same cosmological parameters. And so we now have better image simulations with better estimates of bias and a redundant estimate of bias that returns precisely the same cosmological data set. We're now going to change tack slightly and go to Robert to discuss covariance.
Okay, thank you very much, Angus. I'm Robert, and I am going to talk about the analytical covariance modeling in KiDS Legacy and how it changed from KiDS 1000. And the biggest change is actually of infrastructure nature. So in KiDS 1000, what we had is a bunch of codes which were all doing different things. And our idea was, okay, we take all these codes, put it in a big bucket, and we have a unified code. Fairly easy. What we did instead was we wrote an entirely new code from scratch and validated it with the old codes so that, yeah, things agree. And the result is the one covariance code, which was written by kids for kids and adults and everyone else. So if you want to use it, you just go on GitHub as shown here and try the code out. And what is the code actually? So it's a covariance code for projected large-scale structure observables. And is natively in Python, so it should be fairly easy to use, but some of the heavy lifting is actually done in C++. As an input, you just specify the input in some simple configuration file, and then you just run one Python script and you get a covariance out, hopefully. And it's primarily designed for a 3x2 analysis. In this talk, I will mainly focus on the cosmic shear aspect, of course, but it also contains all the functionality of covariances which have ever been used in the kilodegree survey so far. Well, therefore, also which will have been ever used in the kilodegree survey because it's KiDS Legacy after all. So let me highlight a couple of things. Here we study the effect of the different components of the covariance matrix and how they influence the inference of, in our case, S8. So what I show here is the difference in S8. Then this gray band here, this is the fiducial covariance we are using, and this is the 1 sigma contour basically. And these blue lines have one of these things always basically turned off if you want, or changed, right? So each line just changes one thing with respect to the fiducial. It's not like that I change one thing here and then two things here. So the first thing is where I write no pair counts, this basically assumes that all the sources we have in our survey have the same weight and they are uniformly distributed, basically, right? And we calculate the covariance with this assumption, and we actually see that it barely changes the result on S8. Here, for example, we have no feedback, we have no supersample covariance, no non-Gaussian covariance. Then here we don't have intrinsic alignment in our covariance, and we see that all of these assumptions don't really change the result or the answer on S8 drastically. The last thing I would like to highlight is here the new mixed term, and this is a more accurate modeling of the combination of cosmic variance and the shape noise. Usually it's assumed that those exist basically in an infinite survey and that they decouple, but weights and mass basically introduce additional correlations. And this is something we model in the new covariance, or we can model in principle. And this is kind of the largest effect if you look at it like this. So now we know how the covariance basically changes if we change different components. But is the covariance actually correct in the first place? So we have to compare two mocks. And what we do here in the upper triangle is we run log normal mocks with glass, and we put a realistic mask, realistic number density, realistic weights on it. We run a lot of those, and then we just calculate the covariance as an ensemble average. And the lower part here is the analytic covariance, and already by eye you can see they look very, very, very similar. The largest difference actually exists on large scales due to the mask, because for some of the terms, especially for the cosmic variance term, we assume just that we scale up the covariance by the fraction of the sky, which is an approximation. It's commonly known as the F-sky approximation. And this is where the covariance fails. However, we find that even if we analyze our data with this covariance, we find similar results. So the analytical covariance is good enough for what we are doing. Another important point is that for KiDS legacy, since it's fairly deep, it picks up larger scales than KiDS 1000, for example, which was not so deep because we only had 5 tomographic bins and we only went to ZB equals 2. So therefore, nonlinear effects in general are not so important in KiDS legacy because you see larger scales at higher redshifts and the lensing signal from the high redshift dominates in the first place. Another thing we can do with the one covariance is consistency checks, right? So you have the same tracer, in this case cosmic shear, but you want to analyze it with different summary statistics. And this has been done in KiDS all the time, that we use different statistics to test also for internal consistency. And the statistics we use in KiDS legacy, and we already have used before, are the Cosebis, written here, the band powers, and Xi plus and Xi minus. And what the one covariance code can do for you is can calculate the cross variance between those different statistics of the same tracer. And you see here large correlations, of course, because you essentially probe the same thing on the same scales. It's just ever so slightly different between the different tracers. And this is key for the consistency checks Benjamin Stolzner ran for KiDS legacy. Another thing which was an open question in KiDS 1000 was the covariance matrix of the clustering redshifts. So I show you here the tomographic bins of KiDS 1000. These are the guesses for the photometric redshift distribution. And you have a reference sample, a spectroscopic reference sample here in gray, which you would like to use to calibrate these redshift distributions, as Angus said earlier. And what we did in KiDS 1000 is we just used a jackknife covariance, and we had these funny blobs in this covariance 5 years ago. It was not really clear where they come from. We had some idea, but we just wanted some reassurance, basically, that these things are actually correct. And therefore, we used the one covariance code to calculate actually the covariance for these kind of samples. And as you can see, you find the blobs also in the analytical covariance. And you see that these blobs are always there where the photometric redshift distribution peaks in each bin. Right? So here you have the first bin, so it's very low. Then you have the second bin here. That's why it sits here. And that's basically a coupling between the between those two samples here, between the photometric sample and the spectroscopic sample. That's the cosmic variance term of those. So we validated this jackknife covariance. We went on and using the jackknife covariance because it's easier to calculate from a code we already have, but we have more trust in this jackknife covariance that it's actually very reasonable. The last thing I would like to highlight is that the one covariance code is super flexible. So you can basically do any combination you want. And what I brought you here is a 3x2 analysis. And what I did is I analyzed the clustering, the photometric clustering with the real space correlation function W of theta. I analyzed galaxy-galaxy lensing with the band powers, and I analyzed cosmic shear with the Kosevis. And the one covariance code gives you all the correct cross covariances between these different probes. So you can choose any summary statistic you want and get the right correlation out. You can even define your own summary statistics and pass them basically as files to the code. So this is what we did with the covariance matrix. This was my part. Thank you.
In the last section, we're going to talk about changes that we've made to the way in which we've validated KiDS legacy, in particular with regards to internal consistency metric. And for this section, I'm again going to throw to Benjamin Sturzer.
An important part of our analysis is an extensive study of the internal consistency of the KiDS legacy dataset. And this is to ensure the robustness of our main cosmic shear constraints. And the idea in general behind these tests is that we split our data set into various subsets, and then we perform a split cosmological analysis, which means that we model each subset individually with its own set of parameters. And this allows us then to quantify whether or not the two subsets would prefer a different cosmology. And if they did, then this would be a sign of an internal inconsistency. And we then evaluate several metrics that we classify in 3 tiers. The first tier is an evidence-based metric where we use the Bayes factor and the suspiciousness, which allows us to quantify if the data actually prefers our split cosmological model over the fiducial one. And secondly, we check the posterior distribution of the difference between the two copies of each parameter in the split model. And we quantify how much this distribution then differs from 0. And again, if we find that it deviates from 0, then this would be a sign of an internal inconsistency. And finally, we also looked at the posterior predictive distributions. And here we quantify whether or not the data in subset A is compatible with being a realization of the posterior predictive distribution coming from subset B. And considering the splits of the data, we have greatly expanded the list of tests compared to the earlier KiDS 1000 analysis. First, at the data vector level, we looked at different redshift bins. And in the plot on the right, I just show the measurements for all combinations of redshift bins. And we select here bin 4 and all its cross correlations as our subset A. And the second subset would then be composed of the remaining redshift bins and their cross correlations. And of course, we can isolate each of the 6 bins in the same way. And very similar to the redshift bin test, we can also test the consistency of the autocorrelation signal here on the diagonal versus the cross-correlation signal on the off-diagonal. And final test at the data vector level focuses on different angular scales. And here we also make use of the additional summary statistics, the binned two-point correlation functions, and the band power spectra. And we also make a comparison between the different modes in our Kosevis summary statistic. Additionally, we divided the catalog itself into different subsets. And here, an obvious choice is to divide the catalog in measurements in our northern patch and the southern patch, which are shown here in green and purple. And secondly, we also make a comparison between samples of red and blue galaxies. And this is done by using estimates of the galaxy type that are reported by our photoset measurement code BPZ. And this is inspired by an earlier work that was done on KV450. You can see the corresponding measurements here in red, and blue. And as an example of these consistency tests, I want to show just the results of the split by redshift bin. And here we can actually make a comparison to the previous KiDS 1000 analysis. So in this plot here, you can see the constraints from the auto and cross correlation of individual bins in yellow and the remaining bins in red. And you can see when you look at bin 2 that there is some inconsistency found in this bin. But back then we have checked that the impact of this bin is on the overall cosmological constraints is actually negligible, because that's just because the signal there is quite low. But still, it's something that is interesting to note. And if we now go to the equivalent plot for KiDS Legacy, we can see that all 6 bins here are in very good agreement. And more importantly, we don't see anything that is similar to what we have seen in KiDS 1000. And in that sense, KiDS Legacy is a lot more internally consistent than KiDS 1000. So this was just one example of our consistency tests. And you can find the remaining ones in our paper. But the main conclusion of this analysis here is really that all of our tests indicates that KiDS Legacy really is the most robust KiDS catalog to date.
So that's the status of cosmic shear as reported by KiDS Legacy. As you can see, we're now in the regime where, according to KiDS, there is no more significant SA tension with regards to the CMB and cosmic shear. This conclusion comes off the back of one of the most robust, if not the most robust, analysis of the kilodegree survey to date, and one that has demonstrated new and more robust methods of calibrating the data and modeling the signals on many, many fronts. We're looking forward to the discussion session and going through any questions that you might have. And until then, please feel free to go through the various publications related to KiDS Legacy and contact us on Slack or otherwise if you have questions.